Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this ausEE Tube Feeding Awareness Week special panel with myself and two researchers from the Succeed Child Feeding Alliance. We're really delighted you can join us. And what we've got for you today is a discussion about some of the things we've been doing at Succeed around child tube feeding and the way that families thrive and survive, some of the challenges people have told us about and that we've learned about through our research, and some things that you can do at home after the panel that I hope will be really helpful and practical, which is one of the things that's really important to us at Succeed. Now, my name's Dr. Chris Elliot. I'm a paediatrician, and normally in these sorts of panels, I'm the one who gets interviewed for my expertise, but at Succeed, we really care about turning these usual power structures upside down a bit and acknowledging that lots of people have lots of expertise to share. So today, I'm going to be the interviewer, and I'm really delighted to bring to you two extraordinary researchers, Associate Professor Anne Dadich and Cathy Kaplun, and we're going to have a chat together. So let me introduce the two of them first. Associate Professor Anne Dadich is affiliated with Western Sydney University in the School of Business and is also a registered psychologist. Anne has a lot of expertise in health service management and particularly in taking research and turning it into action, which is something that those of you who followed the healthcare research sector know is a real challenge for us. Anne is particularly interested in talking about and learning about lived experiences and brilliant care. So this is care that exceeds our expectations, that brings joy and delight and makes our hearts sing. And again, if you've read a lot of healthcare research, this is quite unusual to have such a positive frame when it comes to what really matters to people and how to make things amazing. Cathy Kaplun is a researcher also at Western Sydney University in the Transforming Early Education and Child Health Research Centre. Cathy is an expert in qualitative research. This is research that's particularly interested in the story behind the numbers, the how and the why of our lives. And we're extremely grateful to have both of you with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
So, I've spoken a little bit about what we're hoping to achieve in the panel, and I might start with you, Anne. I think this is a great opportunity for you to tell us a bit about the Succeed Child Feeding Alliance, who we are and what we do.
Thanks, Chris. So we represent the Succeed Child Feeding Alliance, and Succeed, it's an acronym for supporting children with complex feeding difficulties. In essence, we're a group of health professionals, academics, artists, and families who are passionate about supporting children with feeding difficulties and their families. Now, although all child health issues matter, feeding difficulties are particularly important because of their direct bearing on child development and well-being. In addition to these personal implications, feeding difficulties can also have social and economic implications. As such, our mission as an alliance is to bring joy back to mealtimes.
That's right. And Anne, I'm really privileged to have Anne as one of the co-founders. I'm also a co-founder of Succeed, and it's worth mentioning Professor Nick Hopwood and Katie Morrowby, Jess Gowans, Kate Dishaquill, Anjana Rejmi, all these amazing people that you can meet if you go and visit our website. And we've been working together for about 4 years to try and change the world for children and families who tube feed. Cathy, you're an expert in qualitative research. So this is the how and the why. I'm more familiar with medical research. It's about numbers and p-values and diagrams and figures and things like that. Can you tell me a bit about qualitative research? Because it's such an important thing, part of what we've been doing at Succeed. Why do you do it and why do you think it matters?
Well, thanks, Chris. And yeah, p-values and that sometimes go right over my head. So I really love qualitative research because it's so powerful telling a story. And hearing that story from someone who's had lived experience of whatever it is we're looking at, and in this case it's tube feeding, tells us so much information, and it really puts often the background around the figures. So if you start to delve into what people are telling you and you really look at it, I mean, what are we looking for? Why do we want to hear people's stories, And it's about developing the picture of what's happening in that space. What are the commonalities that are occurring for people across this experience? What do they share? And also, what are the differences? You know, what makes things, you know, more tailored for different families and things like that. So we pull all those experiences together, all those stories together. We spend a lot of hours reading through them and pulling out the information and actually what we call sort of mining it in a way, like you do with other data. And we pull out the things that we can see, and we call them themes. And we start to look at the themes that are coming out in that material, in those experiences, and we really connect with the people when we're reading those experiences. And then we start to think about, well, what's working for these families and these children? What's not working for these families? And what can we do better? What can we improve? So it's so important. Everybody loves a story, but there's just so much in those stories, and there's so much we can pull out around, you know, developing programs and implementing practices that actually are really supportive and bring out what we call the brilliance in healthcare. Yeah.
Thanks, Cathy. I mean, you know, this is relatively new to me. 4 years ago it was anyway, when I first met Anne and Nick. And, you know, I think as human beings, we've always been drawn to stories, and you see a lot of stories in the media, and a lot of people have been extremely brave about sharing their stories about their healthcare journey or whatever. And the thing that struck me about qualitative research that's so powerful is how much work it is to listen to a group of people's stories and then sit with those stories for months and months, or even a year or more sometimes, and revisit them and think about them, and then those themes that you drew out. And I mean, one of the lessons that I learned was that, you know, qualitative research can be as rigorous and reliable and repeatable as all the numbers research that we're more familiar with. And I think I've always been passionate about SUCCEED not merely being a collection of stories, although stories are really important to us, but actually being rigorous so that we can go out into the world and advocate proudly and say, these are the experiences of our families, and we can prove it because of the research we've done. And I think there's a subtle difference there. I mean, you know, can you tell me a little bit more about what it's like to just read through these stories over and over? I know for me, I was in tears the first time I read some of the stories that were shared with us, even though I'm a frontline practitioner who's done this for many, many years, just the different types of information people share as opposed to what they share with me in a clinic. What's that like for you and your team?
Yeah, look, it's, you know, it is confronting. You know, it's confronting, particularly for me. My focus is on children, and you know, hearing about children that aren't doing so well, and from families that are, you know, that are finding it really difficult to get the care that they might need, you know, for their children in those spaces can be very, you know, it's heart-wrenching, really. But, you know, looking at those stories, there are, and Anne and I have been working, you know, closely on doing this sort of work. There are moments of brilliance. There are moments when things click. There are moments when everything falls into place, and those families do really well. It can be, you know, it can be a complete stranger who helps them sometimes. It can be their clinician, their clinical team that's helping them and supporting them. It could be family and friends that pull around them and provide that support. But it's those moments of brilliance that we've been focusing on recently, you know, to really pull out when does that occur? What happens in those situations? What's around families that are making those things work really, really well for those parts of time, you know, in the space of the child's journey in treatment or in care. And that's really heartwarming, you know, to see those glimmers of hope in those spaces, and for us to learn from that about how do we do this better? How do we really pinpoint those moments so they're not just those glimmers, they are usual care. They are what every family gets all the time. That's what impassions us to do this work. You know, that's the aim of all of this. Yeah. Exactly.
Hear, hear. And I think that's one of the things that Anne and you and the team have really brought to SUCCEED over many years, this focus on making things brilliant, not just documenting things that are hard, even though that's really important. So, Anne, you know, one of the things we've learned through the research is that many families who tube feed their children actually don't know any other families who tube feed their children, particularly at the beginning. So what I wanted to ask you now, because I do think it's terribly important that people understand that the beginning days can be really difficult and they're not alone in that. And I'm really curious to know from you about some of the themes of the challenges first that families have shared with us. And then we will talk about some of the things that's really worked secondly. And then I'll come back to you after that. And I'm really also curious, because we speak to a lot of clinicians, to learn their perspective of what it's like to deliver tube feeding care, because I think families don't often have the opportunity to understand what it's like to be in my shoes or my colleagues' shoes. So let's start with the families first, though, Anne. What sort of themes have come through the research about what is actually difficult or challenging about tube feeding for them?
Chris, I'm sure I'm telling you nothing new, or indeed people who are listening to us today, but many carers, many family members feel incredibly isolated, thinking that they're the only one in this situation, feeling stigmatized, particularly when there's a visible tube that others can sort of pick up that something is awry. Many families and carers feel unheard, that their concerns are not being heeded, that they're often dismissed as being quite anxious, quite worried for no reason, although they can certainly recognise a significant reason for their concern. They often sometimes feel blamed and unsupported, particularly when others don't understand and don't get feeding difficulties, whereby others just think, you just need to feed your child differently. You just need to do it this way or that way. Whereas unbeknownst to those who are pointing the finger, they've tried myriad ways to feed their child, but it just doesn't work for whatever reason. So these are some of the patterns, I guess, or the themes that carers often cite when they think about and reflect on the experience of being a carer of a child with feeding difficulties. And there are so many anecdotes, lived experiences that are, as Cathy mentioned, just heart-wrenching when you hear anecdotes about, comments that family members have made, comments that friends have made, comments that strangers have made in the street. And these, some of those individuals, families and friends, are supposed to be sources of support in our lives. But when they don't have that lived experience to relate to the experience of these carers, the carers just feel that, unsupported, to be blunt, and unsure where to turn to. And it's quite ironic in a way, whereby we've got all of these carers, many of these carers, feeling isolated, feeling that they feel, the point I'm making is they're feeling the same way, which I find quite ironic, because they all think that they're in this boat alone, where indeed if they only had opportunities to connect with each other, they'd realise that there are so many people in the same boat with them. Turning to some of the clinicians, and similarly, there are indeed clinicians who either provide feeding care inadvertently in terms of being they're a generalist, for instance, and they provide some feeding care or support, but there are indeed, as we know, specialists that provide this support as well. And many of them often feel constrained by what they do, by what they can do, how they can do it, and when, and often because of the strictures around them, the way the health system works, the guidelines that they have been provided. And indeed, as we know, there are very few, if any, universal guidelines to say these are the best ways to deliver feeding care. And in the absence of that, families, carers, clinicians are working this out as they go, because there is the absence of that clear guidance. And that can be a good thing, because you can tailor that support, but it can also be a bad thing, because you feel like you're flying blind. And as we know, with trial and error, there are some mishaps along the way. Things don't always go to plan. And there's as I said, a trial and error process until you find that sweet spot and get to the point of care that is working for the child and for the family and for the team as a whole, as an integrated whole. What these things are telling us, I guess, collectively, when we take a step back and think about these challenges, that without the lived experience, family members, friends, and clinicians don't always know how to be supportive. That's not because they're trying to be difficult by any means, but they just don't necessarily have the lived experience. They're not in the shoes of the carer or the child, and it can be difficult to understand how to operationalize care practices in the home. What is it like to manage mealtime, particularly when you've got other children at home, other commitments, a job, how you negotiate this with the school. So these complexities, I guess, collectively say that the lived experience is incredibly important to give us shared understanding of what it's like to live these experiences.
And I think you've really hit on one of the things that I'm most passionate about, I know most people in Succeed are most passionate about, and in the broader tube feeding community as well, which is that the expertise that families have and bring, because often families are really isolated, they don't know how expert they are in their own child and their own child's feeding. And anyone who's ever seen the food pyramid, occasional foods at the top and healthy foods down the bottom, knows how easy it is to tell someone what to eat or to feed or what to tube feed. That is a really trivial problem, truthfully. You can just prescribe it in 5 seconds and it's done. Actually encouraging your children to eat a healthy, diverse diet or making tube feeding work for a family, that's a problem for which there's no one answer, no one guideline. And that is a really powerful insight, I hope, for families to know that when they're getting different advice and different perspectives, it's not because people are deliberately, clinicians are deliberately trying to be obtuse. This really is a dynamic challenge for us to work together with. And, one of the things we often discuss is how to encourage, empower, and, give permission to families to stand up and express what they know and what they want, and so that we can work together on the same page. And that can be really challenging. One of the things you showed me recently, which really blew me away, was a little diagram about what it takes to book a clinic appointment. This is just like one tiny little part of what families often find challenging, how to get into clinics. So I'm going to show that now on the screen. Not to get into the weeds, but this diagram shows what has to happen from a person who gets a referral to a clinic appointment being made. And the complexity of this, when you showed me, and I live this is my job, and all of the people around me, admin staff and allied health professionals, it absolutely blew me away. It just helps, I think, contextualize some of the challenges. And actually what I know is that there's a similar diagram that we haven't made yet about what happens at home, that carers and families manage, so this sibling goes here and this formula gets prepared and this tube gets checked and that person sits, and so there's complexities around it. And I think that being transparent about that just helps us all be a bit more kind and patient. And particularly for clinicians, I'm really passionate about us all listening really carefully to families, because we really can't do it without the family's expertise. So Cathy, oh, sorry, go on.
Chris, I just want to acknowledge the contribution of our colleagues Prem, Halal and Dasun, who helpfully constructed the maps to, I guess, unravel the complexities in feeding difficulties, because we often don't know what goes on behind the scenes, and we just think it's really hard to get an appointment. I don't know why, or why is there an incredible delay? Unbeknownst to us, there is so much going on beneath the surface. So I just wanted to acknowledge their expertise, particularly Halal, Prem and Dasun, whose expertise lies in logistics and supply chain.
Well, let's just sit with that for a second, because I'm aware of how some of the work that went into making that diagram. So this is 4 expert researchers from Western Sydney School of Business who sat with clinicians over a period of a year or more, at various times, and getting information and interviewing them and figuring out what happens. And then, so, that's a year's worth of work, or possibly even 2 years when you think about all the extra conversations, just to produce a map of how to make a clinic appointment. This is not a criticism of the system or the individuals or the clinicians, but that's how complicated it is. And we know that families do the same thing. So we put most of our resources into listening to families and understanding their expertise, because we think it's so important. But we've got to also work with healthcare systems, and that's part of that work, and so important. Really interesting. And thank you, yes, to your team and your colleagues for that. Cathy, you come from an education and health research background, and you've done all of this listening to stories and qualitative analysis. What's really struck you? So we're talking predominantly to an audience of families and carers and friends and community. What would you like to share with them from the research, the things that are really important that you've learned or that have made you passionate or inspired? What do you think?
Yes, Chris, I think just to pick up on the point that you made previously about the time that it does take to get the results, I guess, in a research study. and I guess the preparation as well to think about as well. So even by the time we're actually approaching families to have that chat, there's probably been quite a considerable amount of work done through ethics and everything else as well, to get permission even to be able to sit with families. So from a research perspective, it is so valuable to actually have the privilege to sit and have that discussion with a family and for them to share their experiences with us. So I'll put that right up front, because we never take that for granted when we start a process like this. I guess in the research that Anne and I have been doing most recently, which has been talking to families and clinicians about the process and the experiences that they've had, the thing that has come through most to me has been the strong relationships that have been developed. And, you know, that comes from several things that we pulled out from the research studies. And one of the things that struck me most, and it's probably, you know, fairly obvious really, is strong communication between, you know, clinician and family, and not only just clinician and family, but between clinicians and themselves, because that often is where, you know, there is different perspectives, and coming around, you know, a table and talking and sharing those perspectives is really valuable. And that's what we do in research when we're talking to different families. And it's, you know, and when we talk to different clinicians, we try to put those perspectives all together to form this bigger picture of what's happening. And I'm sure, you know, if we did a picture of that, like the mapping that you're talking about, Chris, it would be very complex to put all those perspectives to come to sort of some common ground around all the things that are happening in everybody's lives and agendas and meeting systems and everything else that goes on in those spaces. So yeah, I guess that's the, you know, there's strong relationships, strong communication between people, between clinician and family. Like I can share some of the words even that we've got from families, you know.
Yes, please.
Because, you know, I knew you were going to ask me about this, Chris, because everybody.
That's because of all the preparation we did before we sat down to chat, always. No,
everybody wants to know the results. But, you know, like to quote one of the families, you know, so I think that what's gone really, really well, because the goals we made were really appropriate for my baby and the family, you know. And so now she's met those goals and I'm feeling really happy and satisfied, and so are the clinicians. So, you know, there's a situation where it's worked, you know, where there's this, you know, sharing of goals. They've been set together for this baby and this family with the clinician and the family involved. And, you know, the ultimate thing is that everybody's happy, you know, in that situation. Now, I know that doesn't always happen, but it can happen. And that's what's most interesting to me as a researcher, that there is a way to do this. You know, we don't throw up our hands and say it's all too hard. You know, like there is a way for us to work with families to get the goals met of what we want as clinicians, researchers, whoever in this process, and meet all the goals for the family and the child. And when that happens, it's amazing, you know, and it should be more often. Now, clinician to clinician, I spoke about that, you know, like, here's an example of that. You know, the three of us have a very collaborative partnership. So there's three clinicians working together here. That's something that we all comment on at various times. The fact that we can all working together towards these same goals, even if the way that we're getting there changes, which it often does, but we're all on the same page. And that's the positive that I take out of all of that back and forth with everybody else. So here's the clinicians working together, and they're saying it doesn't always go, you know, smoothly. It's not all, we're not always sort of, you know, agreeing, but we work through it and we get there in the end. So those communication processes can never be underestimated, I think, in that care of the family and the child. Some of the other things, like when that's working well, I think the other thing that really strikes me is that families actually feel heard, feel respected for their knowledge about their child, and they actually then grow in confidence and actually start to advocate themselves, you know, and sometimes that comes from the advocacy that they receive from clinicians and others that they work with. And one example of that is, you know, a mother has actually said, I love that they can advocate for us. And she actually is talking about nurses. She said the nurses just step in, because the nurses sometimes have a bit more time to spend with the patients, you know, and talking with the child. And they're providing, I guess, the care side of it so much as, you know, the clinician is prescribing that care. they sometimes get to hear more of the day-to-day story, I guess. And so the clinicians that respect that and actually engage in that process with nurses and others around the family really get to hear those stories and put, as you say, you put it more into practice. You become more in the relationship. You become more communicative in the questions, are more tailored to that family. You're really meeting their needs. I guess another thing a parent has said here about the connections is there's understandings. They're just getting it. So there's this strong connection. That's really amazing when those things all sort of come to the fore. And the last one I'll share with you is really about the confidence that parents feel. And it said that, as a person that spoke about it, like the others would tell the story for me. I wouldn't have to keep repeating it. And it meant that they know the story and therefore they're more supportive of us. And I think that's where that, we talk about the team around the child. And that's where the team all knows the story. It's all shared. And they pull together. And as one parent finally commented, I can't fault the care we got. And that's what you want to hear from every parent. I can't fault the care we got. And that comes through these processes of building those relationships and communicating really well with families.
I'm sure lots of people listening will think, I want that. I want to be able to feel that. Of course they should have it. No, I mean, that's actually why we all work together. And I know from speaking to dozens of clinicians that we all want that for families and we all strive for that. And the question is, and one of the things, that we've absolutely dedicated ourselves to at SUCCEED and ausEE and Tube Feeding Awareness Week and all of the organizations who are participating in this, we want this, that's what we're striving for. And we're all coming at it in different ways. And some of the things I heard you say that are really powerful is this shared goals, shared stories, shared respect. And so, and so what we are trying to do is make that easier for families and clinicians to come together at that point. So, Anne, this is the positive view of tube feeding healthcare, right? Family care, child care. And so tell us a bit about what we've learned about how to get there. This is the sort of the vision of what we need, and what is SUCCEED doing to help move us along that trajectory?
Thanks, Chris. And Cathy, I think, summed up some of those informative findings from the research that we've done, particularly from the stories. And I just wanted to, I guess, clarify that this focus on brilliance is obviously purposeful, but for a number of reasons. And one of which, as Chris indicated, is to redress the imbalance that we often see, not only about research about feeding difficulties, but even in healthcare more broadly. Most of the research is about the trials, tribulations, the problems, the issues, the gaps, for good reason. I'm not dismissing the importance of those, but it also, by doing that, shuns some of the fantastic experiences that people have with our healthcare system, both as recipients of care, as a consumer, as a carer, but also clinicians, health service managers, and even policymakers as well. So this is about redressing that imbalance. It's also about recognising the great stuff that people are doing, because I think more often than not, that goes unrecognised. Understanding the ingredients that make that happen and understanding how do we make the stars align more often. There are no magic bullets by any means, but it's incredibly helpful to learn through those stories some of the patterns that we're finding.
Would it be fair to say, Anne, that doing more of what works well is a really self-fulfilling and valuable, rewarding thing for everyone, as opposed to trying to do less of what people hate or less of what doesn't work? And so that's part of why we have this focus, because we think that families, clinicians, researchers around the country, around the world can take these lessons and eagerly do more of what works well as a really powerful way of changing people's experience of healthcare.
I couldn't agree with you more, Chris. Positivity begets positivity. And again, I'm not dismissing that the importance of looking at problems. I'm not suggesting that's not important, but it is equally important to look at what is working well. Because there's a degree of self-efficacy that builds, confidence that builds. As you can appreciate, if think of the last time someone reprimanded you about something. Typically what happens is we become defensive. We hold our cards close to our chest. We don't share our experiences. We don't share our concerns. Now, by focusing on positive stuff, what I typically find happens, and it's commonsensical, that people want to talk about the elephants in the room with, constructive engagement. So it's not about blaming, it's not about finger pointing. The problems are talked about, but in a space in which there is psychological safety. People know that by sharing the problems that I'm experiencing as a clinician, for instance, or as a mum or as a dad, I'm not going to have my wrist slapped, because I know that what our collective focus is on in terms of what people are doing well, a strengths-based approach. So again, I want people to know that this is not about ignoring the elephants in the room, but engaging with them in a safe way if and when people want to, because what we are primarily focused on is the stuff people are proud of. And it's a really great conversation starter. When I walk into a health service, or when I talk to a consumer or a carer and say, what are you proud of? It really sets, I think, a very different conversation, as opposed to, how many adverse events happened in this service this week? I mean, that's not necessarily very helpful for a number of reasons. And what we've learnt through the stories that we've been collecting by learning from carers and learning from clinicians, is that brilliance happens. If we look for it, we find it. And it's what, I guess, again, perhaps not surprising to many people, it's often in the smallest gesture or a kind word that can make a world of difference. Now, think about why that might be. It's often because healthcare typically is less than ideal. For a number of reasons. Expectations aren't met, there are system challenges, resources are low, time is poor, a whole host of reasons. And as I said, the absence of clear guidelines to guide me in terms of what do I do to manage feeding care. So in those ingredients mean that healthcare is typically less than ideal. However, when the littlest thing happens that exceeds my expectation, the time that someone spent, the kind word, a gesture, it can make such a world of difference. And it's those pockets of brilliance that mean so much to clinicians, to carers, and to children. Just as an example of one participant who was asked about, what meant something to them, what exceeded their expectation. They replied, it was that specialist that finally listened to me. That's probably a weird answer to what you were expecting. So just the time that someone took to listen to their story and heed their concerns.
And as a clinician, that stuff can change my practice, right? That stuff is powerful for me to know. What about if I'm a parent and I'm not there yet with my care team? So there are still some barriers, either I don't totally understand them or they don't totally understand me. What does the research show about what I can do or what works for me?
That's a really good question. And I think the research is telling us that carers, many of them have been proactive, have exercised personal agency to vocalise what they need and want for them, for their family, for their child. Okay, so they need to feel comfortable, and I appreciate that that's not always easy to do, but feel comfortable to say, this is what I find helpful, this is what I don't find helpful, to let the clinicians know what's working for you. Otherwise, it's going round in circles and it's not going to help the parent or the carer, it's not going to help the child and all the family dynamic. So equally important here is that, and another message related to that, is that clinicians can benefit from the lived experiences of carers and children. So mindful and being open to those stories, to those experiences, and perking up your ears, being mindful, being perceptive to what's going on, and taking the time to ask questions. Now, how's the mum or dad faring in all this? So I guess some of those are the lessons that we've garnered through hearing these fantastic stories that parents and clinicians have shared.
And so that brings us, I think, to pretty much where we're going to end, is a wrap up of some of the work that the concrete work we've done and some of the work we're doing, because most meals, I say this all the time, and it really, I think it's true, most meals happen outside the hospital outside clinic hours. That's how you know you're an expert. If you're a parent or a carer listening to this and you tube feed your child or feed your child at all, you think how many meals happen in hospital, how many meals happen at home, and if more meals happen at home or outside the hospital, then you know more about your child's meal times than I do or your clinicians do. And communicating with your clinicians with stories, particularly around the challenges. It's okay, you don't have to all be rosy-eyed, rosy glasses like Anne said, but if you have a particular challenge about vomiting or tubes being pulled out or blockages or social isolation or daycare or any of the things we hear about, just pick the last time that happened in a really dramatic way or a really way that impacted on you and tell your clinicians that story and really ask the time. I just want to tell you about this problem that I'm having. And that's a wonderful way to communicate with clinicians, because all clinicians are really highly motivated to help. It's actually what gets us up in the morning, but there are barriers, in the same ways there are for you. So, I was reminded of some of the projects you've got coming up in the next, year or so, and, projects like How to Be a Good Friend, which isn't a prescription, but some prompts for family members who want to help but don't know how, or even for clinicians, how to help joint clinician decision-making. And we're working on resources that can live in clinics that clinicians can refer to help them invite families to share their priorities and to collaborate on decision-making. So this is some of the work we've got coming out. What have we already done, Anne, that people might be able to find and use now?
Well, on our website, there are a wealth of resources that people might find helpful, regardless of whether you're a child or whether you're a carer or indeed a clinician, particularly resources around stories. So hearing what life has been like for other families who have kindly shared with us the richness of their experiences. And we equally welcome additional stories. So if you feel inclined to share your stories, please contact us and we'd warmly welcome those. In addition to those, we've hosted what we think is Australia's first picnic for children with who tube feed. And that was held a couple of years ago and was well received. And because of COVID, it took a different form, but equally still well received. And we very much hope to continue those. In addition to working with, sorry, please.
I just had to jump in because we have these two amazing parents, Irene and Anna, who have actually organised 3 subsequent picnics in Sydney. But we're trying to think of a way that we can do it, all around the country, and they've all been cancelled due to COVID. And so we are committed to doing more regular picnics and catch-ups. I just had to do a shout out for Anna and Irene.
No, absolutely.
Into it, and it hasn't quite got there yet.
But it will. So although we've been disappointed by recent events because of COVID, we're certainly not discouraged. And indeed, the parents that we work with are incredibly enthusiastic, as indeed we are, in getting those more often, because in facilitating those, hosting those, as Chris mentioned, what we find is that many parents and kids are saying this is the first time they've ever seen another child who tube feeds, which is, it's quite interesting given the number of children who require tube feeding. We also, in addition to that, our colleague, Professor Nick Hopwood, has been heavily involved in the development of resources, supports for people of the Nepalese community, particularly because of the growing number of the Nepalese community in particular parts of Sydney. And indeed, we have an interest in learning more about how we can helpfully resource and support other culturally diverse communities as well. So please feel free to contact us, reach out to us and let us know what needs and interests you have so that we could potentially work together. And indeed, as Chris mentioned at the outset of this event, we certainly turn power dynamics on their head and we prize what parents and families want. This is not directed by what academics or clinicians want. It's driven by the needs and interests of families, carers and children who are saying, this is what we're going to find helpful.
Well said, Anne. Well said. And I don't know that we've spoken very publicly about it, but the other big idea we have for this year, which came directly from children and families, was to help cafes and restaurants and public spaces become tube feeding friendly so that people can feel more confident to leave their house and go out. Now, of course, the pandemic's made that a bit awkward because we're not all going to cafes like we used to, but the idea that daycares, preschools, parks, cafes can be made tube feeding friendly based on the lived experience of families is something we're really passionate about, and we're working on that this year. Cathy, we're nearly to the end. Is there anything else that you've been reflecting on that you'd like to share or suggest that families do or think about?
I'll just find the mic. I think in all of this, ultimately, it's don't give up. You know, don't just keep going. You know, you are your child's advocate. You are there. You know your child. What we are here to do is to provide that support, but also I think to be, as one clinician actually said, you know, I want to be their cheerleader. You know, it's about providing that continual support and hope. You know, that you can manage this, you will get through this, and there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So, you know, we're actually here to provide that, and through the lived experience you share with us, we can make it better for other families as well. You know, sometimes the benefits are not for the families that actually work with us and share their experiences at that time, but, you know, there is this, you know, giving back, if you like, and providing a better future for other children that come, that follow, you know. So I think sometimes that can be lost because, you know, there's huge benefits in giving back as well. When you've had a good experience and you share that with us, that helps us provide that to somebody else. So yeah, that's my final thought.
Thanks, Cathy. Thanks. And I think that's a wonderful way of summing up why we are all passionate. And there's, you know, dozens of people who have been involved in Succeed over the last 4 years and who still give their time and energy. And it's because we know that children and families deserve brilliant care, and we are care providers, or we are researchers who are passionate about these areas. And to see your family, if I'm speaking to a family or carer, and to learn from you and your expertise, and to then share that widely and see a whole community of children and families be elevated, and you know, that's worth getting up in the morning for. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. We've done it for many years. We've got many more years to come. So I would really love it if you're interested to please visit childfeeding.org, which is our website. You'll find some how-to videos, how to tape a tube, how to give a tube feed, things you might want to show your family and friends or learn from yourself. There's a whole section of real stories where families have shared their own stories of their journey, which people can find really useful and interesting. There are some cartoons that are, show children who tube feed in a really positive, brave, strong and capable light, because a lot of children thrive and can participate in the world because of their tube, not in spite of their tube. And so that's a lovely way of showing to, again, your community, your daycare, your school, and just changing the perception around these children. So please visit childfeeding.org. There's a mailing list there if you'd like to join us. We're on Facebook, Succeed Child Feeding Alliance. And please, there's also a contact button. So if you do have an idea, a suggestion, a story, please send us an email. You can be anonymous or yourself. It doesn't matter to us. We do, might take a week or two to get back to you, the times being what they are, but we take every email really seriously, and it all goes towards our mission of making mealtimes joyful for children, no matter how they choose to feed. So thank you, Cathy, thank you, Anne, and we look forward to hearing from you all.
And thank you to Chris. Really appreciate this opportunity, and to ausEE.
Yeah. ausEE have been amazing, and Sarah and the whole organisation, and happy Tube Feeding Awareness Week, everybody.